authenticate the documents.
Well, that was the first thing that had to be done. We couldn't move forward until we knew they were authentic. So I went out into the newsroom at that point and went to the national desk. And as it turned out, they had just received a call from Ken Clausen, the reporter who covered the Justice Department and therefore the FBI. And he had called to ask if anybody at the Post had received these stolen files. And the reason he could ask that question was that the other, two journalists, and the other four people, 2 members of Congress and 2 journalists who had received them had turned them into the FBI the previous day. And so the FBI knew which files had been sent out. They had told Ken about that. So the national desk got me to describe the files I had to Ken. He went to the FBI and said, okay, somebody at the Post has received, here's what they've received. And they said, yes, those are copies of the stolen media file.
Small irony here. I'd like to point out that very same Ken Clausen then leaves the Post to become the communications director for Richard Nixon's White House, all during Watergate. He was the chief flack for Richard Nixon, but he's the guy who authenticated these documents for you.
That's right. And that's why he shares the byline on the first story that day. Yeah. So it turned out that the FBI thought that because they confirmed the document, the authenticity of the documents, that we therefore would not publish the contents. And that may seem strange by today's standards, but this was really the beginning of the culture of absolute secrecy regarding intelligence agency changing. I mean, up until this time, it was pretty much assumed by everybody, Congress, attorney generals, but also journalists, that intelligence agencies could keep their secrets. They were not held accountable the way other government agencies were. So they made that assumption. And then when they found out we were considering publishing, sort of all hell broke loose.
So, Keith, I'd like to bring you into it because clearly, as Betty is just outlined, this was quite a consequential series of documents she received, and she couldn't have received them without the work that you and your fellow band of burglars did back then. So tell us how you came to be a part of this burglary, what your role was, and a little about what happened on the evening of March 8th, 1971.
So the way I came to be a part of it was I knew Bill Davidon through what was referred to as the Catholic left. Bill Davidon was one of the local Philadelphia area leaders of the peace movement, and he was also a professor at Haverford College. He was one of the main people, that kept things moving forward in the peace movement in the Philadelphia area. I met him through the so-called Catholic left, which I always think is funny because neither Bill nor I were Catholic. But anyway, this was the group of loosely organized group of people, mostly on the East Coast, the most famous members being the Berrigan brothers, who were breaking into draft boards and stealing records. And Bill and I were both involved in that activity, and that's how I met Bill. And he approached me one day and wanted to see if I was interested in a new idea he was working on. And his new idea was to break into an FBI office and steal the files and send them to the newspapers so that, the public at large would know what those of us who were active in the movement already knew, which was that the FBI was doing a lot of stuff they shouldn't have been doing to spy on and suppress legitimate First Amendment activity.
So just to set the stage here a little bit, at the time, if I recall correctly, you were like driving a cab, right?
Yes.
And here this sort of, anti-war activist comes to you and says, I want you to help me break into an FBI office. What goes through your mind?
Well, it's a little hard to reconstruct after all these years, but I think it's fair to say that my mind was a little blown at the beginning. Certainly wouldn't have been something I would have thought of on my own as being feasible. But of course, the idea of exposing this the way police power was being used against all of the movements for change was, like, yeah, that's awesome. Is this really even possible? As it turned out, Bill was right. It was possible.
So Keith, you didn't have any ethical qualms about this. You believed
no.
that, there was just no, right. You believed that there was a higher cause here, that this was the right thing to do. But what about, this could have been a bust, right? I mean, you could have broken in and not gotten the documents you were looking for.
And got arrested.
How did you then plan the operation? What was your specific role in it? And how nerve-wracking was it to pull something off like this?
So I think one of the reasons Bill invited me was that I had some skills with regard to locks. In my experience with the draft board raid movement, I concluded that in a lot of cases, we'd be better off picking our way into some of these offices rather than breaking in, with the noisier methods. And so I set about learning how to do that and teaching other people how to do it. And in terms of my role, that was my main role. I mean, I helped with the yeoman work, casing and in the meetings discussing, the planning and so on. But most of the leadership of that sort of thing came from people with more experience, Bill, John, and Bonnie, and so on.
So, but you were the guy who goes up and that night tries to pick the lock.
Right.
On the door. It's a small FBI office. It's the second floor in an office building in Media, Pennsylvania. Of course, it's the night of the Allie Fraser fight, which was no coincidence.
No, it was not.
You picked that night because you figure everybody is going to be listening on the radio to the fight. And you get there, but it was a little more difficult than you had planned.
It sure was. So when I got there, I knew what to expect. I was not worried at all. I go up to the door, and instead of one lock on the door, there's now two locks on the door. And one of them is a lock that's a completely different design than the one on your front door, and is a much higher security lock, and you can't pick with the kind of tools that I had with me. So both Bonnie and I she'd cased the inside and I'd cased the outside pretty recently, and that lock was not there. So that really threw me off. It was like, did I miss this somehow? Which really upset me, or how did it magically get here? So anyway, to make a long story short, that door was out for that night. There was no way to get through it quietly. So as Betty describes quite well in her book, I was really flustered, didn't know what to do, went back to the motel room. We had an extensive conversation, and somebody, I believe Bonnie, I won't swear to that, suggested, well, what about the other door that has the cabinets in front of it? And we're like, oh yeah, the other door. So I went back, and the other door only had one regular lock on it. So that was no problem. I got through that lock in no time. Unfortunately, there was also a deadbolt on the door. So that's where the Ali Fraser fight also came in handy. You're going to make noise when you break a deadbolt off. There's no way around it. So the building superintendent lived in the apartment right under my feet, and I could hear the radio. So I waited for that to kind of swell and broke through the deadbolt. And then the door moved about an inch and ran into the cabinet. So the cabinet was massive, and I could tell how heavy it was. So again, I couldn't move it with the tools I had. I went back out to the car, got the jack post out of the trunk, and used that as a lever to slide it across the carpeted floor a little bit at a time. So that was a little more nerve-wracking than I planned.
I got to ask, so in 1971, the FBI, the premier federal law enforcement agency and domestic intelligence agency in the United States, doesn't have an alarm system?
I mean, come on, they don't need an alarm system. What criminals are going to break into an FBI office? They'd have to be nuts.
Well, can I interrupt here?
Please do.
They had tried to have an alarm system. The previous September, the head of that office had asked headquarters for an alarm system and also for a very large safe for their most important files. And the person in charge of making that decision at headquarters was none other than Mark Felt.
I love it.
Oh my
future
God.
Deep Throat.
Deep Throat.
And Mark Felt said no to both of those requests. And correct me, Keith, if I'm wrong here, but I think that if you had discovered, especially like if Bonnie had gone in and discovered that there was a very well installed alarm system, it might have made a huge difference in whether or not you would have even decided to go in.
It would have been much harder, that's for sure.
The lines to Watergate from this story are so delicious from Mark Felt and Ken Clausen. So we know from FBI documents and from Betty's excellent book that J. Edgar Hoover was enraged about this and launched a nationwide investigation to find the burglars who broke in and stole these secret FBI documents. Keith, you said you had no ethical qualms about doing this. I want to play you a clip from an interview I did 7 years ago when I was at NBC, when I did a piece on this with Patrick Kelly, who was one of the FBI agents in charge of the investigation. Here's what he had to say about what you did.
The statute of limitations has long expired, but Patrick Kelly, the ex-agent who investigated the case back then, says that the theft remains inexcusable.
They're rationalizing a criminal act. I don't believe such people have the right to take upon themselves and make decisions.
Keith, your reaction?
Yeah, I've heard it all before. You know, a couple things. One is, first of all, what they were doing was literally against the law. They were using their power to persecute and intimidate people who were doing things that are protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. That was not legal or ethical or moral, and it's contrary to what democracy is all about. They were spending about half their energy on political surveillance, 99% of which was on people who weren't doing anything even nominally criminal. You know, if they had been investigating us, the Catholic left, I would have less quarrel with that because after all, we were breaking the law. But what they were doing was wrong, and Congress made it even more wrong after they found out about it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if breaking the law is so sacrosanct, would Mr. Kelly then turn in his Jewish neighbors if he lived in Germany in 1938? Is that what he would do? Or send back fugitive slaves from Pennsylvania back to the South and after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed? Of course, we need laws to have a civilized society. I get that. But those laws don't always work and they're not always right. And when they're egregiously and obviously wrong, then it's your duty to break them. And so I have zero respect for that simplistic idea that, you know, whatever the law says always goes. Yeah. That's ridiculous.
Now you and the other burglars made the decision to stay anonymous after the burglary. And you even went so far as, I think, not to really communicate with each other for some period of time. And I guess you came out only after the statute of limitations had expired. Is that right?
It was long after that.
Long after that.
We came out after Betty asked us to.
So why did you choose to stay anonymous? I mean, presumably you didn't want to be prosecuted for these crimes, but it would have been an opportunity to stand up for your principles, but you chose not to. So what was your rationale for staying anonymous all those years?
I mean, my personal rationale, 80% of it was because I didn't want to spend the next 30 years in a federal prison.
Not a bad reason.
That's a pretty good reason. Yep.
I stand by that decision. And the option of moving to Moscow was not available to me at the time. So. And the other 20% was, most of the press at that time was not the Washington Post. Not that the Washington Post was perfect, but most of the press were shills for whatever the government said. And so this would have been a story about our personalities